Good morning. Blessings to everybody who's joining us here on the live stream. We're continuing our Bible study on how we got the Bible. So we're using the Lutheran Hour Men's Network's study that they put together a few years back with Dr. Paul Maier. This has been an interesting study so far, as we've covered a few things like what the Bible did and how it was starting to come together and the like. And now we're going to spend a little bit more time just looking specifically at some things, and in particular today, the Old Testament, which leads me to my opening question for everybody. We'll see how much everybody was paying attention during our opening here just a few minutes ago. What is the primary message of the Old Testament?
That Jesus is coming?
It's about Jesus. Yeah, it's about Jesus. I'm going to get into a little bit of nitty-gritty here, but one of the interesting things is how much Jesus actually shows up in the Old Testament. A lot of people think Jesus doesn't show up on the scene until the nativity narratives in the Gospels. But Jesus is there in the Old Testament. Though he doesn't go by that name, so to speak. He goes by a title. The angel of the Lord is how it's usually translated. Though it would be which can be a little confusing because we think of angels, the creatures with the wings and the white flowing robes and whatnot. But the word angel actually means messenger. And so what we can understand is the messenger of Yahweh.
Messenger what?
Messenger of Yahweh. Yahweh is God's name. Sometimes it was transliterated into English as Jehovah. So Jehovah, Yahweh equivalent. One's the Latin pronunciation, one's the Hebrew pronunciation, as best as we could figure. Anyhow, so he's shown up. And he's actually telling us about himself. He's actually doing things with his people. He's already interceding, and that's what we see in the Old Testament. And so the Old Testament is absolutely important, which means Satan's going to attack the Old Testament. He's going to come at it in every single different way that he can possibly come at it. And one of the ways that he does so is he tries to get us to doubt the truthfulness of the Old Testament. And trying to point out to us things that supposedly archaeology hasn't found and say, well, see, it's not true. And plus, there's also things like, well, how can we possibly be sure that what we have today is what they had thousands of years ago? As far as the Old Testament goes. The Old Testament books are really, really old. And some of them pushing like 4,000 years old.
Not quite that, but 14 BC, I think, is that supposed
14 BC? That's right, yeah.
By 1400 BC, yeah.
Yeah, 1400. But I'm in the ballpark at least. But anyhow, without any further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Paul Maier.
We'll watch on the screen here.
In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's the very first verse of the Bible. And I think it's a good place to start in our study of how we got the Old Testament. Personally, I would prefer to be called the first covenant rather than the Old Testament. I think a lot of Christians, for that matter, including the clergy, think that old is somehow bad. And most people like new things, don't they? But without the Old Testament, the first covenant, the New Testament doesn't really mean much. And what's it all about? It's about creation, it's about the fall and the sin, it's about God's redemptive promise of a Savior, it's all about God's grace. And all of this is repeated over and over again.
The Old Testament is written by a number of men, inspired by God, of course, inspired by the Holy Spirit, who put it down in various forms. We think maybe some of the earliest pieces may have been on animal skins, but papyrus was certainly around by the time Moses was alive, and there was an alphabet by that time too. And so it would have been recorded on paper, recopied and recopied and recopied until the most recent copy that we have is about 1000 AD. So scribes first, and what we call Masoretes, who are the successors to the scribes, would have meticulously recopied that text over and over again.
The first writings of the Old Testament are dated around 1400 BC. The final book of the Old Testament, Malachi, was written about 400 BC. That's a 1,000-year period over the writing of the Old Testament in which it took place.
How all this came about and how all these books were gathered into one place is probably not as much a matter of conjecture as it is of history. Although we do know that by the time Jesus is on the scene, there are really two collections of Old Testament literature, although they didn't call it Old Testament at that time, they would call it scriptural biblical literature. And one would be the Septuagint, and the other would be the Hebrew Old Testament. What we have today with the collection of books that we have today is the same as the Hebrew Old Testament in Jesus' day. The Septuagint added what's known as the apocryphal books, books that Protestants generally consider as helpful but not inspired literature. Roman Catholics generally approach them as inspired but secular scripture. The Septuagint has kind of an interesting history. Israel was under the influence, well, first of all, conquered by Alexander the Great, and then Alexander the Great's method of conquering was to leave some of his retired generals behind to Hellenize or bring Greek culture to the area. Part of that Greek culture was Greek language. So even though the Romans are in power by the time Jesus comes on the scene, it's Greek culture and Greek language that sort of dominates the cultural and linguistic scene. So the Jews in their official language are speaking Greek, they're speaking Aramaic, they're reading Hebrew, they're multilingual. But Greek is the sort of linguistic currency of the day. Besides that, there were some Jews scattered in Africa, northern Africa, whose everyday language was Greek. So there was a determination that the Hebrew Bible needed to be translated into Greek. The story goes, and this is pretty far-fetched, but the story goes that either 70 or 72 scholars were asked to translate the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, and they did so, and when they came back together, they had translated it exactly the same way into Greek. That's pretty unlikely. It's more likely that 70 scholars got together and came out with a product that was a collective product of 70 scholars. Hence the name Septuagint. Septuagint means 70. It is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And it was in use. Apparently, a lot of the New Testament does quote from the Septuagint as opposed to the Hebrew Scriptures.
Here before me is a scroll that survived the Holocaust. It's from the western part of the Netherlands, and it's over 225 years old. The oldest manuscript of the Old Testament that we have today is the Masoretic text from about 1006 AD. And one would think that with these number of years, there's got to be a lot of transmission errors from the time of Christ to the present. That's what a lot of liberal scholars thought for many years. That was until one day,
and a shepherd boy walking along between the Dead Sea and the bluffs and pitches a rock, so the story goes up into the caves up there and hears something breaking and goes up the hill and discovers all these jars of pottery with scrolls in them. I don't think he knew what he had. It wasn't until he hit some antiquity dealers around Palestine that the people figured out what they had. And what they had was a cache of many of the biblical texts that predated the Christian era by just a few years. And so you jumped 1,000 years from the latest manuscript, now with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947, you've jumped 1,000 years back. Now the fascinating thing with that to me is you would expect that in 1,000 years you would find a lot of differences in the text, but there would be a lot of scribal errors, that kind of thing, in transmitting the text. There are very few. Very, very few. And the ones that are there aren't substantive.
So, Joel, why did you bring me to this section of the great Arizona desert?
Well, Dr. Maier, is a great question, because really, this is the only place that I know that we have access to that closely resembles the topography of the northwestern corner of the Dead Sea, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in a little community called Qumran. Now, what makes this area so unique is that it's very, very dry.
Of course, the dry air would preserve the scrolls, too, as they were sealed in those jars. You see what's so important in terms of analyzing biblical manuscripts is this common argument you hear that because the scribes had transcribed them every 100 or 200 years when the ordinary scrolls turned to crumbled and so on, they had to maybe occasionally make errors, and then the errors were absolutely multiplied as they went through generation after generation of manuscripts. And so very often the biblical critics claim that our Bible today may not even resemble what happened in terms of the original photographs as they're called 2,000 years ago. So this was the first time I think scholars had a chance to see how carefully biblical manuscripts were copied across a 1,200-year period. Because before this, as you pointed out, the Masoretic text from a little over 1000 AD was the oldest surviving manuscript in the Old Testament. And at Qumran, they discovered 2 scrolls of Isaiah that were 200 years old in Jesus' day.
And you're 100% right. We can find even more remarkable things. For instance, there were 36 copies of Psalms found in this scroll. 21 copies of Isaiah. There were 30 copies of Deuteronomy. And yet, all of the scribes there, all of the script that was found, if you do a side-by-side comparison of the 36 copies of Psalms, for example, besides the occasional spelling error that wouldn't change doctrine at all, or change the temperature of how 1 degree to the left or right, there are virtually 0 scribal errors in the 36 copies of Psalms from the writings of Dr. Yehud. It's remarkable.
So now we have a way to test across 1,200 years of history how this manuscript tradition took place.
And the similarities, and let's be more specific, the lack of maybe some errors was phenomenal, as you were just saying. They were so careful in their scribing. Yes, did they make some little notations on the side when, as you said, there were more than 2 columns of a mistake, but they were very, very, very careful. And the check and balance of the community there in Iran was really world class. We're not having the technology that we know today, where you have spell checking, where you have word counts and things like that, but we know at least the accuracy and integrity is still there.
I think it's very important because today, Islam, the greatest competitor to Christianity, claims that the Christian scriptures were ruined by manuscript errors so soon after it happened. And the Holy Quran is the final revelation of God to correct all that. And there are some groups today, like the Mormons, for example, who claim that the Book of Mormon now corrects all the errors made within 60 years. Give me a break. In the New Testament. That's not true. And this is why the Qumran Dead Sea Scrolls are of fundamental importance. It's fascinating, it really is. You know, there may be one more reason why the Dead Sea Scrolls are of tremendous importance for Christians. The higher critics, the extreme biblical critics, let's say in the last century, used to claim that the Gospel of John was written way into the 2nd century. The Tübingen school in Germany, you recall, said that the Gospel of John was probably written around 175 AD, and therefore forget any eyewitness testimony. But then, of course, the discovery of the Rylands Papyrus way up the Nile of between 100 and 110 shows that that was wrong. But the reason the critics objected to John being early was because the concept of light versus darkness, love versus hate, war versus peace, those were not Jewish concepts of the time. So one of the first discoveries made at Qumran was the scroll that said the war of the sons of light versus the sons of darkness.
that was one of my favorite ones too. And of course, there's so many interesting texts in there, whether it's the temple scroll, or whether it is the famous copper scroll with the treasure map and all the other stuff. But it really is interesting that you bring up dating. Because if we look at the apologetics that have been defending the book of Daniel and when it was recorded, and lo and behold, so many have said that the book of Daniel was recorded after the events of Jesus. However, when we use scientific methods, we use their tools for research, we use their tools for fact-finding, and yet there's the book of Daniel in the Great Qumran discovery, and it dates to 125 BC. That then, through their conspiracy theorists, completely out the window. Now the book of Daniel is very much before Christ, and that's using their tools of being able to scientifically date them.
Absolutely. Then, in the New Testament manuscripts too, there's more and more scholarship, as you well know, giving earlier and earlier dating for the Synoptic Gospels. I mean, even great scholars like David Noel Friedman, for example, now of blessed memory, he's come out with an article saying that the Synoptics had to have been written before the Book of Acts. The Book of Acts had to have been written before Paul's death.
Right.
In 66 AD or something like that. So really, the great fire of Rome is not mentioned, the fall of Jerusalem is not mentioned, and they wouldn't mention those things.
Now, Dr. Maier, in just a few minutes, we're going to have an opportunity to handle, examine, touch and feel with our own eyes original Dead Sea Scroll material that we have back in the museum.
Not a copy.
Not a copy of the original thing.
Oh, I can't wait.
Well, Dr. Maier, you didn't have to wait very long. I just want to thank you for such an enjoyable time out there in the desert. But what I have here is an original biblical Dead Sea Scroll fragment from K4 at Qumran. And what I'm about to show you here, very few people outside of Jerusalem ever get the opportunity to hold, study, examine with their own eyes an original, on sheepskin, biblical Dead Sea Scroll fragment. That's from the book of Daniel. It dates to 125 BC.
Oh, fabulous.
Now remember, Dr. Maier, as we've taught already, the Dead Sea Scrolls weren't really scrolls. That's a misnomer, because very few complete scrolls were actually found. The great discovery came in over 19,000 pieces that have taken literally 60 years to put back together again into the 800 or so scrolls that we know today. Now, to help understand a little bit about the science and academia of this particular project, here in my hand is a fragment of a Torah scroll from the book of Leviticus. And as you can see, two columns, as you were mentioning before, stitched together. And if we were to be on the reconstruction process, so this is just 350 years old, sheepskin as well, as we were putting the scrolls back together again in Jerusalem, what we would have to do is find where that particular piece went in the text.
What a puzzle.
And we would literally put it back together again on where it was supposed to go. Now remember, Dr. Maier, there were numerous copies of the exact same scroll. For instance, 36 copies of Psalms. So how were we able to put the scrolls back together again? Three unique techniques, and the choices there. Handwriting style. Very unique handwriting styles to some of the scribes. And because of infrared technology, we were able to line the piece up where it was supposed to go. Now, Dr. Maier, here is an example of the technology that was used in Jerusalem in the reconstruction process. Here is how things look to the naked eye. However, when we switch things over to the infrared, look how clear that text becomes.
Fascinating.
How, because of the duplicate copies, were we able to make sure that piece went into the right spot? Well, remember, just like humans, animals have unique DNA. Therefore, all we had to do to make sure the right spot, the right piece went in the right spot, we would then DNA test pieces to the north, west, east, and south, and if they all matched the same DNA, we knew we put the scrolls back together again. Literally, it was taken over 60 years to perfect and to publish accurate data out of Jerusalem. Literally has taken that long, only one reason, making sure that we put the project back together again accurately. Remember, Dr. Maier, we were talking out in the desert how any mistake we make gets scrutinized. The scientism, the humanism movement can make hundreds, if not thousands of mistakes, and they're justifiable. Christianity and Judaism, we make even the slightest mistake, we're literally obliterated by the secular media.
Absolutely.
It is unfair, but this is just a wonderful little piece. And again, a perfect representation of what the Dead Sea Scrolls truly were. 19,000 pieces put back together again into over 800 of these scrolls.
It would really have been great if Moses and Isaiah, David, and others had had their own blogs that told us when they wrote what they wrote. Well, we don't have that. But what we do have are references in the Old Testament to the gathering of books. The final book of the Old Testament canon, and canon, by the way, means a measuring stick, that which something's measured by. The final book was Malachi, written about 400 years before the birth of Christ. Those 400 years in between are called the intertestamental period. Now, during that time, God was silent, carrying men of old to write down his words. But that doesn't mean there wasn't any writing during this time. In fact, during this period, the books of the Apocrypha were written, books that are included in the Roman Catholic and some Protestant Bibles. We could not have a complete discussion of the Old Testament without examining its prophetic content that points to the Messiah. There were over 300 prophecies fulfilled in the person of Jesus Christ. The Old Testament has many that were made hundreds of years before Jesus was born. Precise, detailed prophecies, such as where he would be born. Micah 5 verse 2 tells us that. How he would be born, according to Isaiah chapter 7 verse 14. In fact, how he would die. Psalm 34 verse 20. And history has proven without any doubt whatsoever that they were fulfilled exactly as the writers of the Old Testament had prophesied hundreds of years earlier. In the book, Science Speaks, mathematician and scientist Peter Stoner applies the rules of probability to the prophecies. The chances of just 8 of these 300 prophecies being fulfilled are 1 in 10 to the 17th power. That's 1 followed by, well, a number I can't even pronounce. Try quintillion or something. In the book, Professor Stoner illustrates this as follows. He says, let's try to visualize this chance. Suppose that we take 10 to the 17th power, silver dollars worth that is, and lay them on the face of the state of Texas. They will cover the entire state 2 feet deep. Now mark one of these silver dollars and stir the whole mess thoroughly. Then blindfold a man and tell him he must pick out that marked silver dollar. What chance would he have of getting the one with the mark on it? Just the same chance that the prophets would have of writing these 8 prophecies and having them all come true in any one man. Pretty amazing, wouldn't you say? But those odds are for only 8 of the 300 prophecies. If you adjusted that figure to 48 being fulfilled, the odds are a staggering 1 in 10 to the 157th power. That would be 1 followed by 157 zeros.
One of the most poignant sections is in Jesus' baptism when the voice from heaven says, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased." And what the voice from heaven has done is grab 2 chunks out of the Old Testament. This is my beloved Son, from Psalm 2, which probably was used at the coronation of a king and pointing to the ultimate king. And in whom I am well pleased, from one of the servant songs in Isaiah, that also pointing to the ultimate servant. And so it's baptism, in just that very simple phrase, every Hebrew would have known that. This comes from a royal song and a servant song. This is a king, but it's a servant king.
Professors like me have spent an entire lifetime studying the Old Testament. What I hope we've accomplished is for you to understand the amazing involvement by God with this creation through His Word. In the meantime, the next part of your study guide is going to examine some of the other prophecies about the Messiah.
So that was quite the monumental task.
So he said they found him in 1947. And
Yeah.
It took them 16 years. So 2007 before we really knew what they all said.
Not quite. They were doing some really painstaking work all throughout those 60 years. So information was coming out, I wouldn't say on a regular basis, but it was coming out. Some of it was because they found complete scrolls. As the museum curator pointed out to them that they had like 17 scrolls or something that they found were complete. And then the rest, they're trying to piece together like the world's largest jigsaw puzzle with missing pieces.
So while you were in seminary, were they releasing new information, or had they kind of gotten a lot of it?
By that point, they probably were on the verge of having most of it. The technique that the curator pointed out using the DNA thing is something that came along much later and just sped things up exponentially. This collides two of my great interests, theology and biology. There have been massive improvements in our ability to manipulate and read DNA. And that technology was then translated into this archaeological study where they went from, okay, let's try and line these things up with the particular passages. And I will say it's not quite the let's slap it up against the scroll. There was a simplified version. If they had words, you could translate the words and you get an idea where that might show up. And so that's they would actually be making educated guesses as opposed to just scrolling through lines. But they went from that to we'll test this piece, we'll test this piece, we'll test this piece, and we'll see which lambskin this comes from. Once they had that, they could compare it with others and go, okay, these things are going to go here, here, and here, and here. And that it sped things up really quickly.
Would it even be a whole book in one lambskin? Probably not.
No. You would at least be able to get a page. If you notice them with the scrolls, they're sections of lambskin sewed together, and that doesn't mean they come. Well, you guys know how big lambs are.
Yeah.
I mean, you're not going to get that much skin off of one lamb. Like the Isaiah scroll, which is one of the ones that's usually pointed out because that was one that they did find in its entirety, is massive. You can take the table that I'm sitting at, and that's about almost how tall this thing's going to be, and the diameter of the scroll. They are massive things.
Oh, the Dead Sea Scrolls?
Yeah, this would have, yeah.
There were like 19,000 of them? Is that what it said? Or
Well, 19,000 fragments that,
oh, fragments.
I was looking here, they said, I guess, that there were 7 that were discovered whole, and apparently they actually weren't all discovered in 1947, that the
Yeah, they've been
was,
digging them
but
up for
from
years.
56, although they said there was a new one, fragment discovered, I don't know, not too many years ago, the first in 60 years. But I guess, yeah, there were 7 full scrolls from the get-go, and they built the building to house it in 1965, actually. I mean, it's really nice, shrine of the book, as they call it. But
It's unbelievable that's in our lifetime,
I know.
another thing, I guess, there's approximately 950 different manuscripts out of the 19,000 odd fragments that they found.
Yeah, so it really was quite a fascinating find. He didn't mention it here, but one of the popular theories is it is believed that it could be the temple archives. As when the the temple was about to be destroyed, it would make sense that they want to save the books that were there at the temple. As these were things that they've been painstakingly gathered. And so it's thought that the Levites have taken the temple library and moved it to a safe place before Jerusalem fell and the temple was destroyed during the exile into Babylon. And the ages of them come pretty close to that. The Isaiah scroll, of course, is not going to fit within that being 200 years before the birth of Christ. It's in the intertestamental period, which is what brings in the other popular theory is that this was the home of a particular Jewish denomination or sect, whatever you want to call it, but who were kind of hardcore into reading the scriptures. Even more hardcore than the Pharisees. It is, and it is an absolutely wonderful find, and it's really incredible for us to be able to look and see the scroll that's 200 years old by the time Jesus is born in Bethlehem, and then compare it with the oldest manuscript that we had prior to that point, which was made around 1000 AD, and find an almost exact duplicate. As he said, there was several unsubstantive differences. There was like some spelling differences. That was about it, and nothing that changed any meaning drastically.
And one of my jobs as an editor is to always make sure the Bible verses are exactly the same in any devotional material that LWL produces. And that is difficult.
Yes.
It is very difficult. It's easier in this day and age because you can copy and paste from something like Bible Gateway. But even then, you've got to take out any notations that were added to that, any Bible verse numbers. And I'll find errors all the time that these authors put into their. And it may be just a comma misplaced, but it changes the whole meaning of the sentence. And when you think that those people did that by hand, copying from one to another, I got to see one time an English Bible that was copied back in like about 1400, and it was illustrated. And I saw the original manuscripts, which were like this big, that the scribes did just piece by piece. And I'm thinking, how did they do that without making a single?
I know.
Well, then they had a lot of checks and balances, like
They did.
people would go over it. And
They had like multiple people look over.
But it wasn't a pencil you could erase. It was in ink.
Yeah.
I think you could scrape it off though.
Yeah.
So.
And if you look at some of the older manuscripts, one of the things you'll notice is that there will be numbers at the end of each line and numbers down in the bottom corner. And what those are is they go through and they count each letter to make sure that the same number of letters shows up and the same number of words show up. And that was one of their checks and balances that they would do to make sure that these things were accurate. And if they weren't accurate, they burned them. So could you imagine being the poor scribe who just copied the entire book of Isaiah and makes a mistake on the last line?
But you wouldn't have to burn it because then it could get distributed as an inaccurate copy. I didn't like it back when we typed and we made an error and had to throw that piece of paper away.
And so, yeah, this has just been one of those spectacular things and just really mind-boggling with the degree of accuracy that was transmitted. Now, I will say the Old Testament was a little bit more meticulous in its accuracy. The New Testament's manuscripts are not nearly so meticulous. And part of the reason for that, I think, is a twofold. One, they were trying to do it quickly to get things copied out and sent to other people. it does seem to be the pattern that Paul would write a letter to a church, and the first thing that church would do as they're reading it is somebody would be copying it down and making lots of copies to send to all the churches around them. And then those churches would do the same thing and over and over and over. And so when you're doing that fast, you're probably going to get something to show up because you don't have all the checks and balances. And at the same time, most of our manuscript discoveries for the New Testament have been found in trash piles. If you're digging in the trash, what are you likely going to find? Trash. And so you're likely to be finding the stuff where, yeah, we made the mistake, out it goes. And being the pack rats that churches are, even though it was trash, they didn't throw it out. It just went into the trash room. And some of the monasteries did have what was basically the junk drawer of rooms, where they just chucked all the old manuscripts and things that they had in there without a care as to their accuracy or whatnot. They just, we can't throw this out, and so we're just toss it into this room. And so that's how some of those were found. You won't find the high degree of accuracy in the New Testament as you do with the Old Testament, but we have enough manuscripts that we can have a very good idea of. One that is sufficiently well informed to say we've got what was written.
Quantity over quality for some of that?
Yeah, some of it's quantity over quality. And some of them are just obvious things where, like, you can tell they transposed a line. Okay, big deal. Fix the transposition. And a lot of them are, spelling wasn't standardized. Standardization of spelling is something that happened in the 19th century.
18th and 19th.
18th?
Yeah, the 1700s was beginning of spelling standardization.
Okay. I was thinking Webster, and I thought he was.
Well, right, because he was doing the American version as opposed to that British version. We were being good patriotic Americans.
Yeah, we gotta get rid of those useless U's.
Yeah, Webster was 1818.
All right, so let's.
We're out of time.
I know, and I hate to skip through the scripture reading, but
Do you want to pick up here next week?
yeah, I think that we're actually going to just have to do that because.
Yeah, that was a much longer video this week.
Yeah, it was a much longer
It was
video.
very good.
Yeah, I really like this series because it does address a lot of the issues you might face when you have people coming with you to you with skeptical responses.
Well, his comment that secular people can make a million mistakes and nothing will be said about it, but we could make one teeny tiny mistake and it hits the news.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Yeah,
Christians and Jews are going to be criticized no matter what.
I feel that sometimes we can be doing oodles and oodles of good throughout our communities. And then the Lutheran Church of Missouri said it does one thing wrong and it's national news. It's like, just once. I'd like to see LCMS in the headline and have it be a good one.
Yeah. Well, the comfort dogs. We've been in the headline for the comfort
Yeah,
dogs.
the comfort dogs have made headlines. They've been on Good Morning America and all that kind of good stuff.
So I guess the dogs are better than the people.
Sometimes there's something to be said about that. And one of the most popular exhibitors at the conventions, the youth gathering,
LWML conventions.
yeah, is the Lutheran Church Charities exhibit because they bring the comfort dogs, and everybody wants to go pet the dogs. Of course, we're talking about how many people are familiar with the comfort dogs. Okay, Lutheran Church Charities. They're one of our really big charitable organizations in the LCMS. Started, about 15 years ago. I'm trying to remember. Where they would specially train golden retrievers to just be around people and calming presence. But the idea of going into areas where there's been extreme trauma. So if y'all recall that chemical plant that exploded out near Waco, was it? Do you remember?
Yeah, West.
Yeah, West.
West, yeah.
And just absolutely decimated that city. Within about 4 days, they had like 10 of these dogs there. And the whole idea there is for the dogs to be just a comforting, calming presence. People could just come pet them, hug them, squeeze them. And these dogs are just so laid back that and then they just open up the doors. And all the handlers of these dogs are trained in crisis counseling and witnessing. So they can come in and they can start offering the crisis counseling. They can also start offering the gospel to these people who have been extremely hurt. And there hasn't really been a major disaster, as in one that makes the news, where the dogs have not been there within a day. And so this organization, they've got dogs all throughout the United States. I know there's like about 5 or 6 in the Houston area, a similar number up in the Dallas area. Individual churches have a chance to sponsor and buy a dog, and the handler. And then they actually work within their communities too. We have comfort dogs over at our preschool all the time.
Over where?
At our preschool. And so then, because we had one of the comfort dogs in our area was one of our circuit churches. And so they bring the dogs over and the kids can play with the dogs and hug them and squeeze them and collect their little cards.
I was going to say, you were spot on with 15 years. It was exactly 15 years this month, actually.
All right.
August of 08. And they say they have over 130 comfort dogs right now in 27 states. And they have 3 training facilities in Illinois.
Yeah.
And you can follow them on their website. So if you have one that is your favorite, you can follow them and find out where he goes.
Yeah, you can follow them on Facebook too.
Yeah.
My kids were trying to collect all their cards. I don't think they've come close to succeeding. But anyhow, so these groups, they go throughout the country, and the LCC covers their cost. And so if you're looking for a charity to help out, you can send it to LCC, to the Comfort Dog Ministry, and all of that money goes right to the Comfort Dog Ministry. And it covers their travel costs, their lodging costs, their food, and some of the training. Because congregations also pick up the costs. I think the cost to a congregation to get a comfort dog is somewhere in the neighborhood of $25,000. And that covers all the training, the selection, the purchasing of the animal, and the training of the person who's going to be handling the dog. Not a cheap thing, but it has opened up so many doors. And it's gotten us actually some positive press.
And there's other organizations doing it now too.
Mhm.
I don't know that any of them made the news like the Comfort
No.
Dogs have.
And well, it kind of helped that we led the way. A few
They wear a
times.
collar or something so that you know it's a scarf or something.
A vest.
A vest, that's it. So you know that's who they are.
Yep, and it says Lutheran Comfort Dog on it or something like that.
They have their little logo that says LCC Canine Comfort Dog Ministry Lutheran Church Charities.
Okay. And these dogs are so well trained that they know when their vest is on, they're on the job, and so they sit calmly, they lay down calmly, they just let people pet them, and then when they take the vest off, it's just like having a puppy around. It's kind of funny to watch them because they'll take them off the job to give them a break, and they're out in the backyard just chucking a ball. Now we're out of time, so we're going to close with some prayer here. Heavenly Father, thank you for leading the scribes of old to pay such care and attention to the faithful copying of your word. Give us similar care and attention as we read, learn, and discuss your word, so that our faith may be strengthened and we may share your truth with those people you bring into our lives. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Thank you. You'll hand your lessons back.